Hi guys, while listening to one of A Different Biases videos, it reinforced something that I've been thinking about for some time. So Phil had been discussing the WASPy women and Labour's decision not to go along with a recommendation from the Ombudsman to pay compensation. The amount we're talking about here is about £10 billion, something the Secretary of State explained was her reason not to issue the compensation. Another reason was that some people had been informed of the pension change in advance. However, that isn't what I want to talk about here. Phil discusses two things that Labour have to do to defeat the Tories and reform at the next election. And that's where I'll add something else that I think the government really should be doing.
Basically, the Tories are out of the picture for years now, until they decide to eat some humble pie. This means that Labour have to restore trust with the public. Now, sure, actually improving the standard of living will help massively. But Biden did that, and the Democrats still lost. You need to not only pursue policies that will build trust, you must measure that trust in terms of polling and act on it. Recently, I said I was heartened by the fact that Keir Starmer last month stopped talking about highest growth in the G7 and instead started to say he will measure economic success by how people feel about it. That is good. Doesn't matter how many say, oh, you seem to have got off the boil on this highest GDP. It doesn't matter. What people care about is how they feel about it. Starmer's saying that's what he's going to monitor. So that's good. What's not good is how Starmer seems to be squandering trust in such a cavalier manner. Like, as the winter fuel allowance policy, the inheritance tax on family farms, the bus fare cap. Now this decision on WASPy compensation. Now, none of these are breaking any manifesto or election promises. All of them can be justified. But, and this is a big but, none of these policies are what people expected Labour to do. Labour cannot afford to be seen screwing people over. Now, you can point to details in the manifesto. Most people don't read the manifesto. Biden created the highest growth in the G7. He created lots of jobs with his Inflation Reduction Act. The fact that it was called the Inflation Reduction Act showed that he recognised that inflation was the key concern of people. People's average pay went up. But because inflation was high enough for people to notice, they didn't believe Biden was doing everything he could or should do to protect their standard of living. So you can get lots of things right, and you can still lose out to the populist if you cannot establish that trust. Before the election, Labour made no promises about the WASPy scheme other than that they would make a decision. But for years, Labour have been describing it as an injustice, theft even. They've used the term theft. The implication was that they would right the wrong and pay up. They didn't promise to, but that was the implication. And they did nothing to pour water on that implication before the election. Now, yes, it comes with a price tag of £10 billion. That is a lot of money when budgets are tight. Yes, paying up would cost more than all the other unpopular tax and spending policies combined. But it creates a loss of trust. I often say at times, most of what even a Labour government does, I don't think are quite the right policies, but I give them a pass on anything that I recognise is a necessary part of electoral strategy, because it doesn't matter what your policies are, you don't implement any of them if you don't win the election. So I give them a pass on anything that I think is not a great policy, but necessary. But this is the opposite. £10 billion is a lot of money. But if it helps you win the next election, it's a price you have to pay. The decision is not what people expected, given how Labour had been talking about the subject for years.
Well said. I agree 100%. And what I mean by what I want to add to this is that the government need to U-turn. Now, in politics, you almost never U-turn, because the opposition or the other political parties will call you out on it. But I think the public would actually support Keir Starmer and the Labour government if they U-turned. If they said, okay, Keir Starmer stood up in the House of Commons or wherever, delivered a speech and said, look, this winter fuel allowance change was a mistake. We're going to go back on it. Now, the other political parties would tear him to shreds over that, but the public would welcome it. The same with any other policy, the WASPy women, the two-child benefit cap, the bus fare. All of these things, if the government said, actually, this was a mistake, we're sorry, we're actually going to undo it, they would actually, I think, boost their support in the polls. Because if you think about it as a normal person, if you make a mistake and you own up to it, and you admit that you were wrong, and you try and fix it, you have more respect from people than if you were to double down and say, no, there is no mistake, or there's nothing I can do about it. And this is something that Phil was also pointed to with the Conservatives. The Conservatives continue to refuse that they made mistakes. They'll say, yeah, we made mistakes, but they will never point out what the mistakes were. They won't apologise for the last 14 years. They keep doubling down on, well, it's not our fault, or somebody else's fault, it was the pandemic, or it was the war in Ukraine, or they're always finding excuses and scapegoats. But if the government turned around now and said, look, and these policies, the winter fuel change is not actually an economically, there's no economics backing it. It doesn't work out economically. It doesn't work out politically. So if the government were to do a U-turn now and say it was a mistake, we made a mistake, we're sorry, we're going to undo that straight away, I think the public would welcome that, and the public would have more support for it, and it would actually rebuild trust. Now, the political parties would, well, as I said, would tear them to shreds, but that doesn't matter, because you're not trying to win over Reform UK, you're not trying to win over the Tories, you're not trying to win over other parties, you're trying to win over voters, you're trying to win over members of the public. And I honestly, and I put my hand on my heart when I say this, I honestly believe that if the government did do a U-turn on these things and made it quite public, there's no point doing it behind the scenes. You have to be public and say, we were sorry, we made a mistake, and what we're going to do is we're going to undo that damage straight away. And we're going to learn from that. Now, the Tories in the past engaged in what I've described, or others have described as kite flying exercises, where they would put out a policy, see how the public react. If the public react in a negative way, they would just dismiss it as an unnamed source within Whitehall. But if it's a positive, if they receive a positive response, then they would say, okay, let's run with it and make it official policy. So I'm not saying that Labour should be doing this, but when they make a mistake, when they mess up, they should admit that mistake and U-turn, especially if that is a policy that's not actually going to work economically. Like the winter fuel allowance. The winter fuel allowance change, it means that so many people are going to be ending up in having to fill out loads of forms. They're not going to be able to fill out all these forms in time. And there's a risk that many people will die. People will die during the winter. They always do during the winter. But this will be blamed on the government. If they did a U-turn and then people died, they could easily say, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, I'm just saying this is from a political point of view, they could say this is nothing to do with us. We've not gone through with this policy. We've done a U-turn on it. I think this is actually a good approach to politics because it's something that we do in normal life. And we commend people who admit that they were wrong and try and make amends. But I don't think they're actually going to do it because they're stubborn, because they're playing the political game as they've always played it. They don't seem to understand that there would be a benefit in doing this. They probably look over their shoulder and say, well, if we do it, then we're seen as weak. And I don't see it as a weakness. I see it as a strength. But unfortunately, I'm not a strategist. I'm not telling the Labour Party what to do. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.